Yesterday, we kicked off with Wendy Dark, who is the first female head of the Natural History Unit in over 50 years of the unit being present. And she explored a whole variety of ideas of how she wants to take the Natural History Unit forward in a time when it's not just the Natural History Unit, there's lots and lots of other independent companies today, and there's also lots of competition, not just from the UK, but abroad as well. And just some thoughts, really, from some of her things. She gave this mental impression of this train, this editorial train that's running along the tracks, which are giving you this picture of how perhaps a story is going to play out on our TV screens. But attached to those trains, or that train, were these creative butterflies, the creative teams that Wendy is nurturing at the BBC in Bristol so that we come up with some good ideas that can engage not just us, but of course everybody throughout the UK. We saw the whole portfolio of the different sort of programming that's going to be happening over the next 10 years or so, or more. And the fact that different programmes are certainly targeted at different people. I asked a question about Autumn Watch and about how we go for a wider audience, and I think Wendy's response really was, well, actually, we're going to look at the bigger picture and see how all these different programmes kind of fit together, and some will obviously target other audiences better than others and what have you. She was talking about story rigour and making sure that we engage people from the heart. Yes, there are people probably like you and I who are going to sit there and really watch something that's going to be maybe a bit more in-depth and scientific. But for 50% of the audiences watching these natural history programmes, it's about emotional storytelling. It's about relating, of course, these things that people are watching to their everyday lives. It was also about making, I guess, natural history television more mainstream, and also linking in with other genres, linking in with drama, linking it in with entertainment and comedy, not just seeing natural history as a single entity within the BBC. And she finished off really summarising that there's three main ways in which the BBC is engaging its audiences. One is through the passive engagement, where perhaps on a Sunday evening we may enjoy watching a natural world or something, but just be watching it. There's not a huge amount of interaction other than that. But then there's the active engagement, the social media, the fact that Frozen Planet was able to respond to what its viewers liked about the programme through Facebook, through Twitter, through other means, so that when it did its Christmas programme, the Christmas programme was highlighting the bits that viewers really enjoyed and wanted to see again. But then finally, there's the hands-on element. The BBC actually going out into the community, for example, with Live and Deadly, and doing a sort of roadshow where people can meet the presenters, but get much more hands-on with the sorts of things that are being put across on television. And finally, she gave another kind of mental picture of spaghetti and lots of peas being sort of mixed up in that spaghetti to still get across those important messages. For example, recently there was a programme about elephants and showing these baby elephants getting caught up in the ravages of this river and they couldn't get out. That was the way of the emotional storytelling, but in there was also stories relating to poaching, for example. So unbeknown to people, those peas in the spaghetti were being forked out and what have you and eaten up. People didn't realise it, but they were finding out about other elements of elephant conservation while they were watching this emotional kind of story take place. We then went into looking at various different things. We had engaging the next generation, for example. We were looking at technology as well. And in the engaging the next generation, we find out about the fact that parents are becoming helicopters, this new term, helicopter parents, because actually parents are not allowing children to become bored. They're not allowing children to suddenly be in the garden or outside and see something and go and explore it. Their parents are always hovering or taking them to venues, taking them to clubs and places. They're always being occupied. But that some of the solutions to getting children out about relate to perhaps obviously learning and education in schools, perhaps growing locally, accessing families to family-friendly green spaces, to adopt a more benefit-risk approach to dangers so that children are more aware of what they can and can't get away with when they're outside, and also to promote nature as a key part of family life. And we both heard from Q, who've got some big money from the big lottery to be able to engage young people, 12 to 25, with UK Wildflowers as part of the Grow Wild project, and the National Trust with their Project Wild thing, a film that's being produced, and campaigns relating to outdoor nations in partnership with other key wildlife organisations. Something that stood out for me actually in engaging new audiences, which was one of the other breakout sessions, was Sue Porter talking about disability and the fact that actually we have vulnerable situations rather than vulnerable people, and that for sustainability we need to look at environment, the economy, but also the social aspects. She mentioned the fact that environmentally sound shops are often less accessible than our big supermarkets that are perhaps causing the most issues perhaps with regard to sustainability. And in the apps for engagement, looking at new technologies, we heard, well, there was the new meaning to the word hack, not in terms of hacking into computers, but the Field Study Council's developing prototypes, new digital learning tools that are called hacks, to again engage people with collecting data in rivers, for example, or rock pooling and other types of outdoor scientific activities. An iSpot, showing evidence really that once you know the name of something, it opens up a treasure trove. I know that when I'm travelling around and seeing new animals, if I don't know the name of it, and I'm sure many of you are the same, if you don't know the name of it, you can't find out more about it. It doesn't have the same resonance until you know what it is. And that iSpot very much is looking at documenting evidence, but keeping it simple, allowing everyday people to engage with nature and to submit their data and find out what things are. That we have this reputation system, so as people are identifying things on iSpot, they're then getting a reputation for being able to ID things correctly, and therefore you've got this kind of self-sustaining system really with iSpot, so you've got people identifying things accurately, so that actually, as more and more people submit the sightings of a bee or a flower, they're going to be right. We're going to get a definite kind of identification of something in particular. We then looked at the nature of evidence, and we had Andrew Pullin, the director of Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation at Bangor, talking about the collaboration for environmental science, guidelines on how to assess science. We've got it in health, for example. And he was very much talking about that we need to perhaps stop looking at primary evidence ourselves, primary papers ourselves, and actually to look more at synthesising evidence, having people sort of bringing it together and looking at what all this primary evidence actually means. He also said about that simple messages are not necessarily appropriate. It's interesting because I'm always having to communicate very simple messages to people, but he was saying that actually useful messages may be more complex, but they tend to be bound with uncertainty. We also heard from David Slowly, I couldn't pronounce his name. Slowly, thank you, Slowly, from the Prime Decisions. And he was talking about behavioural economics, that making small changes to the way people behave can make a big difference. It's not always about doing something completely different, saying we did it that way, let's try this completely differently. It's about small changes. He was talking about the fact that if you phone up a company, you might get a certain message saying, we're very busy, maybe call later. And he was saying, if you change that message to, if our lines are busy, please be patient, it actually gives across a social message to us, that actually there's lots of people busy calling and that this is something to be part of. Just making different changes there to the message that people are receiving makes a big difference, and that for us it's about experimenting with little changes. Doug Hillier was then introducing the People Engagement Group. This is a group that are one step away from a committee who are able to inform the Secretary of State's policies. And Doug sits on the higher sort of meeting reporting into DEFRA that way. Doug talked about the fact that we need to maybe stop apologising for being middle class. That research has to be useful. What research would help to do something? And that it's also naive to expect equality as an outcome result, but we can make things as accessible as possible. We might get a greater return on the middle class people that we work with, but we need to be also more realistic perhaps about getting to those harder to reach groups. And we then split up into groups to then think about the sorts of target groups that perhaps the People Engagement Group could actually reach out to, and perhaps some of the questions we might want to ask. We had lots of things from reaching out to gatekeepers and gate openers, thinking about not just children. We often talk about children, but getting to their parents and grandparents who are also very good at disseminating and engaging their children or grandchildren. To perhaps look at the method rather than the segment, rather than looking at the age or perhaps where these people are from, to look at how we're doing it, reaching to the largest group that are not engaged, but not through age or class. And we also looked at perhaps the fact that you might have lots of people that don't care, lots of people that care, but actually it's looking for that middle group where you can make little nudges up that kind of ladder of getting them more engaged and changing their behaviour. We then had a succession of people telling us what they are, good examples of good practice of what they're doing in their organisations. And everyone had 5 minutes each to just give a case study of what they're actually doing. We had, for example, Alex Galloway from the Society of Environment talking about changing professional behaviours, and that now there are 7,000 chartered environmentalists, and that their roles should be just as important as chartered accountants. iSpot was talking about the fact that they've got mentors that have been going out across the UK and have managed to reach 80,000 people, engaging people, getting people to report what they've seen perhaps in their garden or outside, online, and getting those things identified. We heard about Hedgehog Street, a 3-year campaign to raise awareness of the decline in hedgehogs and the reasons why they're disappearing. And due to the success of promotion on TV, such as things like BBC's Autumn Watch, their target of 5,000 champions of hedgehogs was completely blasted out of space by now having 23,000 champions for hedgehogs across the UK. We heard about citizen science from Poppy at the Natural History Museum, and the fact that actually when we do citizen science, we can make that data good to use. We might be using people that aren't necessarily so good at identifying things, but if we get photographs verified, if we have an ID challenge and get people who are perhaps connected to experts to look at what's in a certain place, actually that data can be rigorous, it can be put into a model, and it can actually help inform organisations perhaps of certain trends or the presence or absence of certain species. We heard from Roger Martin with Population Manners, who wanted to make sure it's on our radar about the fact that there are too many people perhaps consuming too much in the world, and that we should have a mature debate about this elephant in the room and not just keep going on as though it doesn't really exist when really it does. And we heard from Traffic, who are very much looking at trying to stop the consumption of illegal and endangered animals, and a 5-stop plan really for reaching new audiences. We were given examples of very rich people in China who perhaps look at some of these endangered animals as something of significance, as something that helps them in their status in society, to identify a very specific audience, to find out what influences that audience, developed a practical behavioural model. What is it that presses their buttons? With the example of perhaps getting to the younger generation that those older people perhaps look down to, perhaps their grandchildren. Building a marketing strategy, but with people that really know what they're talking about, and developing a communication strategy. And we finished off that session with some fantastic poems by Susan Richardson. The snow geese flying, migrating, and the wolf, who's afraid. This contrast between comparing perhaps the people and wolves and the different challenges both experience. And finally, towards the end of the day, we heard about the bio-blitzes, the fact that there are over 60 events this year that took part to engage people with their environment, to get experts and everyday people to look at a certain place, perhaps it's their gardens as part of a garden bio-blitz, or a bigger thing like here in Bristol with Arnesvale Cemetery. And we were looking at the pros and cons, things to think about over the next years. And there was a separate conference here with delegates who came to this bio-blitz conference to hear a bit more about the science and what's been going on across the rest of the country. And finally, we finished off with Monty Hall. Thank you. We finished off with Monty Hall, who many of you may have seen on television. He joined the Marines because it had the word marine in it. He was very much talking about the fact that we don't address the armed forces with regards to the environment and wildlife. He was telling us that actually, when you talk to those soldiers, actually what's most important to them is the outdoor world. They are out there soldiering, doing what they're doing because they love being outside. They love being part of that outdoor place. And actually one of their top concerns, if you spoke to them, would be the environment. But yet we don't address that. We don't necessarily engage with that particular audience. He was very much talking and coming back to breaking boundaries, really, talking about how is it then that we can communicate certain messages. And I'm thinking of Hugh Wellington. Monty has been involved with being embedded with fishermen in Cornwall for 8 months last year. And this was a different approach of trying to get this message across of what is really going on in the fishing industry. The fact that while 80% of the fishing boats going out into our coasts around the UK actually are only bringing about 8% of our fish. And looking at what is really going on in the lives of those fishermen and how those villages are only alive because of the fishing industry. And he was just very much talking about how we can communicate these fishing issues in a very palatable form by embedding him in a novel way as a fisherman like this, actually getting him on the boats, perhaps doing lots of things wrong, but lots of things right too. It was enabling us to get an insight into the industry, into the heritage, into the culture, the traditions, and get a better understanding of where these fishermen are coming from. And he also talked a lot about being in America, in Gloucester, in Massachusetts as well, and talking about the fact that they've developed this community-supported fisheries. They've got the fishermen actually coming into the villages, showing young children and families the fish that they catch, giving those families a fish a week, perhaps a different fish a week, showing them how to fillet the fish, the fact that it's got the eyes looking at them goggly, and that it's up to them to actually then fillet the fish and take it home. So it's making that connection, unlike us, for example, we'll be going to a supermarket, it's already sort of vacuum-packed and ready prepared. And so very much, although Monty was here, obviously, in terms of a presenting style, hopefully he still gave that kind of intimate view, really. Obviously, giving up 8 months of his life to actually go into that fishing village there was quite a commitment. And hopefully, to the audiences there, he gave across a slightly different insight and view of what actually is going on in the fishing world. So, it was pretty much a full-packed day there. Apologies if I wasn't able to cover everything that perhaps some of you presented yesterday, but just hopefully that gives you an overview, really, of the sorts of things with regard to breaking boundaries. We're looking now, for example, towards 2020. Doug was talking about the fact that in 2020 we're looking at really getting going with biodiversity. We perhaps didn't quite make it with 2010, but 2020 is the opportunity to really promote biodiversity, make changes. And we're already at that. Julian said to us yesterday that we're at that cusp of things really beginning to change and happen. And we've seen that evolution throughout the life of Communicate. So hopefully today will be a continuation of looking at how it is and how us, as communicators, can break those boundaries, look at the new ways in which we can engage with our audiences, engage with politicians, engage with people that aren't necessarily working or living in our bubble. And hopefully by the end of the day, it will give you some further food for thought, more questions maybe than answers, but a way in which we can all carry on talking to each other and communicating with each other. Thank you.